Welcome to my Klee guide, in time for her new skin and her third rerun. Klee is one of my favourite characters in this game to this day, and she's one of the oldest characters I have on my account, and she was actually my main DPS when I first cleared the Abyss. So what this video is, it's an update on my old video last year, and I've edited and fixed the audio for it this time. I'm also putting out new sections for new stuff that Klee has, which is mostly Dendro weapons and Dendro teams, but there's also a few cool discoveries that our community has made. So you can use the timestamps if you want to check out specific sections, or you can just watch this video the whole way through. Either way, I hope you find this guide helpful for all your Klee needs. Also, just like before, I still update my written guides, both the endgame guide over at the Klee Discord, as well as the in-depth guide on the Kuki Main's website. Check those guys if you want to learn like literally everything, since of course these YouTube videos cut down on some sections to save time, although this will still end up fairly long. So I hope you enjoy the video. Also, I recommend joining a Klee community like the Klee Discord, or even just my YouTube channel. A lot of trial and error, theory crafting and testing has been done with Klee in our communities. And also, she's one of those older characters where a lot of older guides or advice or just mainstream knowledge on her is often really off the mark. I've made some videos about this before, but over time we've solved a lot of issues that newer players can have with her and figured out great tips and strategies to play Klee to her strengths, avoid issues, and basically the community's figured out how she was intended to be played. Hopefully I can share some of that stuff with you guys in this video. So I'm just going to start by going through my Klee so you get an idea on where I'm at. This is my general build. This is what I would use in the overworld and sometimes in the Abyss too. For most teams, it's got Lost Prayer. I've got a mixed artifact build. These are my pieces. It's quite a lot of crit, C0 and triple crowned. So like I said, this is the build I would use in general situations. Then same team, but if I'm trying to speedrun, I would switch to the Widsith because the damage ceiling is a lot higher. It's quite a low amount of crit, but it's passable. I can also just change to a piece like this, and the crit ratio is a bit more balanced. I've also got this Lava Walker set. It's not quite as good as my mix set, but this is still another set you could use. This is what my stats look like on that. If I'm using a Burgeon team, which is a team that might look like this build would look a lot different. I would use these artifacts and it would give me over 1000 EM. I also use sacrificial fragments here, and these are what my artifacts would be. So about her playstyle, first of all, Klee is a glass cannon character. She's both a catalyst user and a child model. So if you combine those, she does have the worst combination in terms of poise and natural defense. And then on top of that, if you play her bad, you could also run out of stamina. So you combine all those three things. She can be very vulnerable. So it's true, she can be squishy. However, there's an upside. Just because she has these things, it doesn't mean you should play scared. Like I said, she's a glass cannon, meaning the best defense is a great offense. Her charge attacks can juggle, stun lock, and essentially trivialize most enemies in the game, meaning if you play your cards right, they can barely even get to attack you. We'd say this is the most important thing and fundamental difference between what separates an old Klee player from a new one. And personally, I think this is way more relevant than learning a lot of animation cancels. Don't play scared, take enemies head on, and I think you'll notice an instant improvement on how comfortable Klee plays. Just go charge attacking enemies before they can even attack you, and eventually everyone can learn how to play without a shield. Number 2, Klee is an incredible battery. Hopefully you know what this means, but if you don't, she basically generates a lot of energy for the team. She has 2 charges of her Jumpy Dumpties, meaning her skill creates a lot of pyro energy. And she also has her Ascension 4 talent, which generates even more team energy when doing charge attacks. Although this doesn't make her Raiden Shogun in terms of energy generation, it still makes her great, and actually I think you can think of her as Raiden Shogun for Pyro characters. Now unfortunately, as of version 3.8, this is actually a con, as Xiangling is still the only off-field pyro damage dealer in the game, and we still haven't got another one yet. It's getting quite ridiculous, to be honest. However, we all know what a great character Xiangling is, so even with just her, this is still a nice utility for Klee. And even if you don't want to play the signature mono pyro teams, Xiangling is still an important teammate for Klee. All you new Klee mains, you can join us in a prayer, and hopefully we can get more pyro teammates in the future. So for her talents, I'm going to skip the boring parts and just cover interesting things that you might not know. Her basic attacks are similar to her Claymore character hits, so she can mine rocks in the overworld. Klee's third normal attack can push back Abyss Heralds and Lectors, which can be nice for pushing them closer to each other. However, aside from this use, her full combo is pretty slow. So in normal gameplay, you usually just mix one normal attack or two normal attacks with the charge attack. This is what I called N1C or N12C earlier. I'll cover animation cancels later. Her normal attack actually has a pretty small AoE, but her charge attack's AoE is huge, and it might be much bigger than you would think. Her charge attack is very good at staggering enemies. This is a very key game mechanic to take advantage of when playing her. Last note on her charge attack, Klee is actually not a charge attack focused character. This is something that actually took a while to conclude in the Klee communities, but essentially we've calculated that across a rotation, Klee's damage distribution is very spread out across all of her talents. And basically her elemental skill and her elemental burst are more significant than people might have thought. And also judging from Dodoko tales, maybe even more than Hoyoverse thought. Klee's skill, Jumpy Dumpty, can actually be fairly complex and nuanced. Like I said, a lot of newer players might underestimate its damage. You get 3 bounces and 8 mines, which can add up to great damage. And both Jumpy Dumpty and the following mine snapshot buffs, which is cool. You can use this skill at the start of fights. It can generate energy for your team and help charge up their bursts. This can be helpful if you finish the previous chamber using up all your team's bursts. However, if you use it at the start of a fight, obviously this damage is going to be unbuffed. Ideally, what most people prefer doing instead then is using the charges once your team has set up. When you use 2 skills back to back, the second set will detonate the first set early, and it gives Klee a nice burst damage window. The second set of mines will then be left on field if they haven't exploded already, and your Anemo characters can suck them up towards enemies. Therefore, one of the keys to maximizing Jumpy Dumpty's power is making sure all the mines blow up hitting enemies. Unless you're fighting a huge enemy, you generally have to suck in those mines with an Anemo character. Venti can't do this well for Klee. He's still useful for Klee in other ways, but this inability to suck mines is one of his weaknesses. Whereas Kazuha and Sucrose have special synergy with this. Both of them will not only suck in Klee's mines, but they actually suck in Jumpy Dumpty altogether. So a pro tip is using Kazuha's skill or Sucrose's burst before you switch to Klee, so it can pull in Jumpy Dumpty early and you can have optimum control and positioning over it. Faruzan, who came out recently, can also do a similar thing to this, but since she's an Anemo support, she doesn't really have much synergy with Klee otherwise. Onto Klee's elemental burst. Now, if you thought the previous attacks had good multipliers and damage, actually those multipliers were balanced with her burst in mind. In most teams, you're supposed to be using those attacks alongside her burst, which fires lasers kind of like a stand. You could think of it similar to Xingqiu or Yelan's burst attacks. Without getting too technical in this video, roughly every 1.7 seconds, you will get 3 to 5 of these lasers, which is a random chance, and they will also randomly lock onto an enemy in this area. Because it's basically just free damage, you want to use this as soon as possible, usually pretty soon after Klee gets on the field. However, a cool tech is that it can be used to animation cancel any talent. The most common situation, which all Klee players will do, is using the burst as soon as Klee throws Jumpy Dumpty. This is the min-max to save some animation time, but watch out if you do it too early, she won't actually throw Jumpy Dumpty, so you will have to learn the timing, but it's not that hard. However, the idea of doing this too early and not actually using the skill is actually used as a strat or an exploit. and players can use this to gain extra stack on something like Kagura's Verity or Crimson Witch. There was another similar version of this bug before, but it was patched in version 2.6. This was something discovered fairly recently. Make sure to hold a direction when using her burst, like pressing the up key on your keyboard or your D-pad. What this does is the burst animation lockout will finish roughly half a second quicker when Klee moves. If you ever notice that Klee is frozen for a bit after using your burst, it's probably because you didn't do this. Personally, when I play the game, I usually always press forward or some direction, so it's pretty natural for me to do this. Also, if you switch out Klee within 10 seconds, as a lot of people know already, the burst effect ends and will not continue. Therefore, as I mentioned before, it is encouraged to use a burst as soon as Klee swaps in, usually just after pressing her skill. Onto her talent, her first ascension talent is actually bugged and you can only get one of these sparks every 4 seconds. This means you probably only get it 2 or 3 times whilst on field with her. And also, if you do the animation cancel, the normal attack which gave you the spark can still cost stamina. Hoyoverse has said this is intentional and not a bug. On the plus side, the sparks do last 30 seconds even when Klee is not on the field. This one is very useful to know. A lot of people don't know this. Whilst casting a charge attack with the explosive spark active, Klee has increased interruption resistance. This will prevent her from being staggered. You might have noticed this sometimes, how Klee just tanks through big damage. Well, it's from this. As for this talent's damage increase, the 50% is actually additive with a lot of buffs in the game. To cut a long story short, with most teams expect a 20 to 25% total damage increase. As for her A4 talent, it's pretty useful since most people on average use Klee on field for around 8 to 10 seconds, which is usually when team buffs run out or her burst runs out. This means you might be getting 6 to 8 free energy per character in your team. As I mentioned before, it's not quite the 20 or so energy that Raiden Shogun might give her teams, but it's still very useful. And also, just to clarify, it doesn't stack in AoE. You're only going to get 2 energy max per actual attack. If you hit like 10 enemies, you're not going to get 20 per attack. Lastly, the nice thing about this energy generation is that you'll get it even if Klee doesn't do damage. And what I mean by that is if the game calculated you would have done a crit attack but you're hitting a shield, you will still get the energy generation. So for animation cancels, I've actually decided not to cover these too much in this video. If you do want to learn more about them in depth, as mentioned in the intro, you can read one of my full written guides to learn about them thoroughly. But the reason why I'm not covering them too much in this video is because I actually think that this is a misconception with Klee. You really don't need to know all her animation cancels and be a gamer god in order to play Klee. And if you ask any Klee mains which animation cancels they mainly use, it's mostly just the simple ones like N1C or N1C with a jump. Contrary to popular belief, you barely even need to know machine gun to get by. That really is very niche. And something like N2C can be important for juggling or keeping enemies stun locked, but you can learn that eventually. It's not a priority at all. Here's an example. In a general rotation after setting up my team, you can see I'm just doing N1C and dodging as needed, and this is pretty much what her high-end gameplay can look like. In conclusion, read up on one of the full guides if you want to learn more advanced animation cancels, but it's certainly not a priority. Just go out and have fun. It's honestly not that hard. However, the second part of controlling Klee I think is still important for players, which is juggling and stun locking enemies. Whether you're in the overworld or you're doing the abyss or you're even soloing with Klee in the abyss, stun locking is one of Klee's special utilities and it's one of the things that make her so fun to play. Essentially, you attack enemies with charge attacks until their poise is broken and you'll be able to keep a lot of these guys flying. From that point, I recommend spacing out your charge attacks to save stamina. For enemies who are flying backwards, you can also do jump cancels towards them to stay in control. So onto our constellations. Again, I'm not going to bore you by reading everything out. However, overall, some of them are fairly interesting because if you've been observant, you'll notice that the design of these constellations back up the initial assessments that 1, Klee is not a selfish charge attack focused character, and 2, she was designed to be played with multiple damage dealers in her teams. If you just want to know what to get, we usually recommend either C0 or C2 as your stopping point. So her C1 is okay. It's a 10% chance for free extra damage and you'll notice that it can activate on any attack. So any of her normal attacks, her charge attack, her skill or burst. Its Pyro application has shared ICD with her burst. However, its actual proc chance has no ICD. Therefore, the amount you get and how it can affect your gameplay is very random and luck based. This is essentially a nod to Klee being a lucky character in the story. Also, this constellation used to get a bad reputation in the past for ruining vape teams, but nowadays with the variety of team compositions, it's not an issue. Besides, people generally get C1 as a stepping stone to her C2. Her C2 is very popular. Essentially, as I mentioned before, most people either have C0 or C2 Klee if they really like her. It also makes her more of a legit support option, but it's still great for her own teams. Against endgame teams, you generally get around a 14% damage increase for the entire team, which is pretty huge. However, it won't increase transformative reaction damage like Kazuha's swirls. And also an obvious thing is, you won't actually get this damage increase until Klee uses her elemental skill and until the mines hit an enemy. So you could change your setups and use the mines earlier, but most people don't. So overall, if you are someone who does consider vertical investment, Klee C2 is pretty nice. At C2, she's actually quite a popular support for Vape Yelan teams, which are some of the most dangerous speedrun teams in the entire game. Skipping her C3 and C5, her C4 is actually pretty good, although this is venturing into whale territory. Anyway, for C4, we see some endgame players hit over 100k even in mono pyro teams, and it can be used quite well in speedruns. It allows you to front load just a little bit extra damage, and you combine that with Kazuha sucking in leftover mines, it does help clear slightly faster. Onto a C6. If you notice, this promotes Pyro Teammates. As for this energy part, it translates into 9 flat energy total for your team. So if you combine this with Klee's Ascension 4 talent from before, she can give her teammates about 15 energy flat, and then whatever energy she generates from her skill. That's pretty solid battery, and it does make her closer to Raiden level. It's interesting, you can actually look at this as a sort of a prototype for Raiden's kit. Anyway, as nice as that all sounded, obviously I don't really recommend this for most players, as generally the idea behind C6 characters is that they are so broken that you can just do whatever you want at that point, and Klee C6 obviously isn't on that level as things like Yelan C6 or Wanderer C6. Her talent priorities may be different than you initially thought, and it can be slightly different than what the in-game analysis tells you to. This is because, as I've already explained, Klee's damage distribution is very evenly spread, and even then, the damage distributions that I show are assuming fully completed rotations. The faster enemies are defeated, the more relevant her skill can be. And actually, if you want to know, some of the high investment players in our Klee community actually say her skill can be the most important talent. But overall, we generally recommend normal attack equals skill, and they're both more valuable than the burst. And if you're looking to crown a talent, you can crown either the normal attack or skill or both, or even just triple crowning, whatever you want. Obviously, these are just our recommendations. If you have more enjoyment going for big damage per screenshot, maybe in a melt team, you can focus on her normal attack. Or if you just use it as a support, you can just level her elemental skill or level nothing at all. So again, skip weapon banners, save for the next region, and whatever catalyst characters come with those patches will most certainly have a better weapon for Klee. Actually, there could also be a future millennial movement catalyst like Elegy or Freedom Swan. Giving team buffs would be great for Klee too. Just save up. So that was a clip from my old guide, and almost a year later, unfortunately that didn't age well. Anyway, for Klee's weapons, here are my weapon calculations. If you want to see the full sheet, it's in this video's description. We do not recommend pulling for any 5-star catalyst, and you should just save your primos. My general advice is to use the Widsith if you want her maximum damage and DPS ceiling, but it has some RNG with its passive buffs. If you don't want to worry about this RNG, then use one of the other high performance weapons like Lost Prayer or Kagura's Verity. Lost Prayer in particular is nice in general because it has the movement speed buff, and because of this movement speed buff, Lost Prayer can make it easier to do some of these cute rolls. So a lot of people ask me what the issue is with catalysts. Unfortunately, Genshin is in 3.8 now, so almost 3 years of a life cycle, And it just seems that Hoyoverse just don't want to increase the ceiling of Catalyst weapons. If I can give some examples with other weapon types, if you look at bows, they went from Skyward Harp and Amos Bow to raising the ceiling with T-Pulse, and now having even stronger universal bows like Polar Star or Aqua Simulacra. Polearms, they had decent 4 stars like Dragon's Bane and Deathmatch on launch, but the 5 stars weren't very universal. However, in 1.3, they infamously raised the ceiling with the Universal Staff of Homer, and then since then they've put out slightly more specific but still versatile weapons overall like Engulfing Lightning, the Catch, and even Scarlet Sands. Swords started off with mid-weapons overall. Aquila Favonia gave physical damage, Skyward Blade had energy recharge and some pretty niche passive. Summit Shaper came after, it gave a lot of attack but it didn't have anything else. Then in 1.3 with Keqing's banner, she came with Jade Cutter, which was just huge power creep. It has lots of crit rate and lots of flat attack. This weapon became the universal standard, so things like Mist-Splitter, Haran, and even Al Haytham's signature weapon were able to be stronger for their signature characters, but usually slightly under or the same otherwise. But regardless, all these newer swords were just a lot better than what they originally started with. So the issue with Catalyst is that they never got this ceiling increase. And to make things worse, the original Catalysts weren't even good in the first place. Skyward Atlas goes all in on attack and you get just a lot of attack. But after everyone quickly realised how strong Bennett was, as you know, attack weapons just aren't sought after at all. There's a reason why you basically never see any new 5-star weapons since the first few patches come with attack. They pretty much all have either crit rate or crit damage or something else. In fact, I think it's pretty much just Shenhe, and she gets attack because literally her elemental skill buffs scale with attack. And then the other 5-star catalyst was Lost Prayer, and the issue with this is that it was either a co-op weapon or in 1.0, Hoyo expected you to spend a lot more time with your on-field DPS. You can see that this weapon's passive requires you to be on field for a lot to actually get something from it. So in reality, the majority of catalysts hardly get to stack this passive. And ironically, it's even worse with Klee because her skill and burst snapshot buffs, meaning they won't benefit from this ramping buff. And this also means, as I explained, her damage distribution is fairly even, so the majority of her damage just doesn't get these buffs. For catalyst users overall, only really in very niche circumstances like Yayamiko using Kagura's Verity or the Wanderer and his Bell weapon are 5-star weapons worthwhile options. But these were specifically designed to be very niche weapons and very tailored for these characters. And with Klee, these weapons aren't even really improvements over what she has before. And with Sumeru, unfortunately, it didn't get any better, since despite more new 5-star catalyst characters coming out, like Nahida or Baizhu, their weapons are not generalist catalysts. And in fact, Baiju's weapon is just depressing. If you remember from my last guide, I've done calcs of theoretical weapons, and if Catalyst ever got even one of Jade Cutter Catalyst or a Mist Splitter Catalyst or a Polar Star, Aqua Simulacra, just any of these well-rounded crit rate or crit damage weapons, they would basically be big buffs for Klee and for most Catalyst characters in general. But unfortunately, it's been almost 3 years now since 1.0, so I can't say for sure when we would ever get a good generalist Catalyst 5-star. So in conclusion, I highly recommend skipping the weapon banner. You can save up for the next region, or if you really were thinking of pulling a weapon for Klee, I would say just go for Klee C2 instead, which is not only stronger than any weapon, but it also buffs your team's damage too. Just use whatever weapon you have. Like for me personally, I have both Widsith R5 and I have Lost Prayer from the standard banner. If you did get one of these weapons from the standard banner, then just use that. But it's really not worth putting Lost Prayer on this weapon banner. Dendro weapons and support weapons. For this section, I don't have any calculations, since these teams you can't really calculate. For Burgeon teams, since actually EM builds are kind of optional, so you can just build her with a normal crit build with a normal crit weapon. One of the interesting things about Burgeon is that you can actually take advantage of EM builds and also EM weapons. Sacrificial Fragments is a very powerful weapon for this. It gives a lot of elemental mastery and it allows her to use her skill Jumpy Dumpty more. Since Jumpy Dumpty generates a lot of energy particles, provides off-field pyro application and deals good damage, the skill is normally balanced around having a very high 20-second cooldown. Therefore, you can see how good Sacrificial Fragments is here, because usually with most characters, Sacrificial Weapons are pretty good, but their cooldowns are a lot lower than Klee's, so Klee benefits more than the average character. And actually it would be a pretty good weapon for Klee generally, but the big issue is, as you know, basically most of Klee's teams don't really have her dealing reaction damage, so before Burgeon she didn't really have an opportunity to use Sacrificial Fragments. Lastly, if you're using a C2 Klee as a support, for example in a Yelan Vape or a Yelan Nihlu Vape team, usually you pick between 1 or 3 weapons. Either Sacrificial Fragments, which gives Klee more mines, meaning more pyro application and more chances for her defense reduction. You can use Favonia's Codex for more team energy generation. Or lastly, if you do have it, she can use Nahida's signature weapon, which gives some team EM buffs. Because neither Yelan nor Nihlu scale with attack, they are HP scalers, you wouldn't use TTDS in these teams, but if you are playing Klee to support an attack scaling DPS, you could use TTDS. For artifacts, this doesn't need to be a long section. Most players are using mixed artifacts like 2-piece Crimson Witch, 2-piece Gladiators or Shimenawas, or they're using 4-piece Lava Walker, which is technically best in slot for mono pyro, but it's very small. Actually, it's only about 1 or 2 substat rolls better, which is about 2 to 5% better at best. It depends on how much Kazuha is buffing you, and if you have things like Bennett C6 or Xiangling C6, or if you're using Widsith. On top of this, the other issue with Lava Walker is you need to factor in that some enemies have elemental auras over their heads, like slimes. Therefore, they can't get pyro on their head, and that means your damage bonus will be lost when fighting these enemies. So it's clearly less universal. For reaction teams, 4-piece Crimson Witch, Gilded Dreams, or Flower of Perilous Loss can also be used depending on the team. If you're playing vape teams, then these sorts of sets aren't a big upgrade over a mixed set. So you can still use a mixed set in these teams. It's not necessary to bother with these full sets. But if you're playing Burgeon, if you want the maximum Burgeon hits, then you're gonna want Flower of Paradise Lost with a lot of EM. Or if you don't have a good set on that, then 4-piece Gilded Dreams is fine. Again, having a lot of EM. This is a common thing, but a word of warning, 4-piece Shimenawas is not a good set for Klee. If you've been following this guide thus far, you'll know that sacrificing her burst damage is not a good thing. And not only that, but you're technically sacrificing her skill damage too, since instead of this 4-piece set, you could have been using a mixed build with 15% pyro damage, or even just another 18% attack set, or even just Lava Walkers, which buffs all damage sources. And again, her normal and charge attacks are only going to be about 30 to 50% of her total damage, depending on the team and the combo, so it's not worth going all in on this. For main stats on the artifacts, if you're not playing a full EM Burgeon team, then it's always attack, pyro damage and crit for every team. Even in a vape team, not all of Klee's attacks can trigger reactions, so EM isn't that important, although some can still be helpful. For energy recharge recommendations, it's technically advised to check either with a calculator or test in-game with your specific playstyle and team. I will also go into specific teams in the team section and give some ballpark figures there. But in reality, for a general guideline, in most teams, Klee does not need much ER. Especially in mono pyro teams, you can have anywhere from 100 to 120 ER and you'll usually be comfortable. And in Burgeon teams, since you only really need her burst for extra shield breaking, obviously you don't need any ER either. Also, some new player advice. For these crit builds, the pyro damage cup is very important. I do see sometimes newer players on occasion using an attack cup just because it has decent stats, but it's rarely worth it. You just have to grind for a pyro cup. So before I dive into team building, I just want to do a quick overview on how you can typically play Klee once you switch to her. To state the obvious, this is just a guideline to keep in mind. It's not important for all players. And also some teams are more flexible, whereas others can need proper setups. So depending on many factors, you can deviate from this. Klee skill can be used early in your setups to generate energy for the team. And also while she's on field, you can stay on as long as you want in order to just focus on juggling enemies and stopping them from attacking you. There's also Burgeon teams where you don't need to worry about these combos. A lot of the time you can just spam normal attacks since you're just focused on blowing up the Dendro cores. So I also want to go through some examples of other synergistic teammates. I think this is very important because a lot of the time when you're building a team, you're playing the team because it's full of synergistic teammates, rather than working backwards and thinking you want to play this style or that style of team and then trying to force random teammates in together just to fulfill that reaction or playstyle. For teammate synergies, it's good to start off with defensive utility. Since Klee obviously doesn't heal or shield herself, therefore we have to look into teammates with defensive utility. Bennett has very fast healing, he has a very huge attack buff with his burst. Playing Klee and Bennett together also gives you Pyro Resonance for even more attack. He can use 4-piece Noblesse artifact set for even more attack. His skill can generate pyro energy, which helps Klee's energy requirements, and in turn she also reduces his. And lastly, Klee's skill and burst can snapshot his buffs. Here's some examples on how these buffs can stack up. For comparison, there's also Zhongli, who has a very strong shield, but damage-wise, he has 20% resistance shred to enemies in close range, and he can either use 4-piece Petra or 4-piece Tenacity artifact sets for a damage increase to Klee. So you can see here, although the shield is very nice, the damage increase that he gives isn't really comparable to Bennett's. However, obviously Zhongli trades healing for shielding, which can be preferable depending on your playstyle or even depending on your team. He is also very versatile and can be pretty popular in some Klee teams. For example, as the defensive option in Burgeon teams, or a lot of the time in hardcore events or even difficult abysses, like players playing Mono Pyro can replace their Kazuha with Zhongli. There's also Jean, who has very powerful burst healing. She also can give pyro resistance shred with her 4-piece VV artifact set. And if you do have her at C2, there is the niche of attack speed. But you can see, although 4-piece VV is very great by itself, it's not as big of a damage buff as other options. And unfortunately, Jean doesn't really have much more relevant buffs in her kit. She can group Klee's mines, which would be very important, but having seen earlier in the guide, Kazuha and Sucrose perform this role much more better, especially as Jean can't provide suction off field. But of course, don't let this stop you if you do want to play Klee and Jean together for roleplay reasons. If you're playing a Dendro team like Burgeon, there are also several other options, including Zhongli as I just stated, but I'll get into these teammates later in the Burgeon team section. So Xiangling is a very synergistic teammate for Klee. A lot of people make this mistake where they focus too much on how Xiangling is supposed to be doing vaporized reactions, or that Xiangling has Elemental Mastery Ascension stats built into her kit, so they don't understand why you would play Klee and Xiangling together. The issue is you end up focusing too much on those and you ignore all the other factors where they do synergize well. For starters, as you may or may not know, a common theme with Xiangling teams is that they have to accommodate for her very high energy demands. Her burst is just really difficult to battery, and that means you either have to spend significant portions of time having to battery her with teammates, switching them in using their skills, or your teams just end up having very high rotation lengths. This is why in most of her teams, even though she's theoretically an off-field character, actually most of her teams end up revolving around her and her damage, and she turns out not to be a plug-and-play damage dealer like you may think. So where Klee comes in is that she's very good at generating energy for the team, especially high pyro particle generation with her 2 charges of Jumpy Dumpty and the energy talent with her charge attacks. This makes Xiangling much more easier to manage than many of her other teams, and this ends up allowing this synergistic core of Klee, Bennett, Xiangling to be one of the few Xiangling cores, like similar to Raiden, Bennett, Xiangling, where her issues with generating energy is not burdensome and it isn't hard to be using her Pyronado off cooldown. There's also further synergy with Xiangling's Constellation 1 and 6, and even Klee's C2 or even her C6 for high spenders. These are all small damage increases, however they can add up together. In particular, since Xiangling's burst doesn't normally snapshot her Constellation 6, therefore it doesn't really work as expected and it's typically considered a weak constellation for her. However, Klee is able to perfectly make use of it. Xiangling's Pyronado will also follow Klee around, and this also snapshots team buffs similar to Klee's own burst. This allows the duo tons of freedom for movement and positioning as needed with little drawback. As I mentioned earlier in the guide, aside from Xiangling, there unfortunately hasn't been other off-field pyro damage dealers or supports released to take advantage of Klee's Pyro energy generation, so this is an area that we have to wait for new characters on. Lastly, if you did watch my national team guide, you will know Xiangling's Pyronado is able to be kind of sped up, or it can hit multiple times. And Klee is one of the on-field characters who can activate this well, since you can dash to the sides of enemies in between her charge attacks easily. However, she might not be quite as efficient as Child in doing this, because his character model is a lot taller and therefore he can dash a lot further than her. The other sort of teammates Klee has great synergy with is Anemo characters. The grouping that they bring is not just important for Klee's Jumpy Dumpty, but it also makes better use of her AoE damage. For example, Klee's burst usually has smallish AoE. However, you can see once these lectors are tightly grouped, the AoE is able to hit both of them. Secondly, the Viridescent Venera set is a pretty big deal, as well as elemental damage bonus from Kazuha or from Sucrose C6. These things multiply all of Klee's damage, as well as these buffs not being bound to ICD rules like a vape or melt reaction would. So the efficiency and overall gain of these buffs is very substantial. And ignoring Bennett C6, if you also notice how all of these are unique multipliers and different than each other, and they don't compete with Bennett's or Pyrores's attack buffs. So again, stacking several multipliers like this is also very efficient. Kazuha in particular, almost all of his kit is very useful for Klee, and it's why you see him a lot in basically all of Klee's teams except for Dendro teams. Aside from VV and his buffs, I've already shown you how casting his skill before Klee's damage window allows control over enemy AoE and Jumpy Dumpty. His skill also has short cooldowns, so you can easily pull in the mines and enemies right after you're done with Klee. Also, his talent can save you stamina, which is very useful on Klee, and it allows more leniency with her ability to dash to dodge attacks or animation cancel, and this can be noticeable. Lastly, Kazuha's ability to synergize with other prospective teammates for Klee is very important. For example, his suction, unlike Venti, it doesn't lift enemies in the air. This gives him better synergy with Xiangling. Nahida is very huge if you want to play Klee in Dendro teams. The unfortunate way with how Pyro Dendro reactions work currently is that you really need to have stable amounts of Dendro application, and Nahida basically does exactly that. Even outside of Klee teams, if you don't use Nahida, then it's really easy to have issues with your burning or Burgeon reactions. The other good thing about Nahida having this consistency is that she makes the other teammates for Klee teams very flexible, but I'll get into that later in the Burgeon team section. Nahida also has her elemental burst, which buffs the on-field character's reactions. This is also very good for Klee. If you combine the fact that Klee doesn't need energy recharge stats to use her pyro application, this allows her to get a very high amount of EM for some of the highest Burgeon hits. So here's an overview on the teams I'm going to cover. So you can say there's the meta teams first, which is mono pyro or triple pyro, whatever you want to call it. And then there's C2 as a vape support for usually for Yelan and Nilu, or there can be Mona as well. Then we go into more situationally strong teams, which is the double Anemo teams. And then we've got Burgeon teams, which is usually Klee, Nahida, a Hydro character, and then some sort of defensive utility. I'll get into it later, but it can be like Kirara, Baizhu, Zhongli, even Shinobu. Then we've got some off-meta teams if you want to mix it up and try something new. There's the on-field vape team, sometimes with 2 Hydros. Then there's overload teams, then there's reverse melt teams. So yeah, these are the teams I'm going to cover in this video. So probably the most important section in this video, and just to clarify, you're free to build and figure out your own teams, especially to suit your own playstyle and roster and what you find interesting to play. So this is mono pyro or triple pyro, whatever you want to call it. First of all, I know a lot of people might think that non-reaction teams like this are just worse than reaction teams, because Genshin is a game with a big emphasis on reactions. Now, hopefully if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that that isn't true, but if you're new, I can explain it quickly. Basically, a reaction ultimately is either just a fancy version of a damage multiplier or just additional damage. In the simplest way, that's all it is. Obviously, we're excluding shield breaking here. But for example, if you take a pyro vaporized reaction, excluding EM stats, it's just a 1.5 times multiplier to the hit that did the reaction. And then with Melt, it's a 2 times multiplier. But not all hits do reactions. For example, you could say with Klee, it might be a third or 40% of her damage. With Xiangling, maybe it's 70 or 75%, just a guess. So actually, if 50% of your hits have a 1.5 times multiplier, so with some simple maths, you can see overall that your damage is getting about a 25% multiplier from the reaction. Anyway, for comparison, if you take Kazuha with the VV artifact set shreds enemy resistance for 40%, and using the damage formula and some diminishing returns, this generally gives about a 28% damage increase, but that's for all of your hits. Then if you factor in his actual elemental damage buff, and overall he might be buffing Klee by maybe 34%. Again, this is all of her damage. And we can also look at Bennett. He's got a lot of different buffs in his kit, but even with just the burst attack buff, that could be a 40% increase to all your damage by itself, depending on how long your character is in his burst or how much attack your character already has. You can do these sorts of similar comparisons with other teams like Mono Cryo, Mono Geo, Mono Electro, Mono Hydro. In fact, even a lot of hyper carry teams, they're kind of just mono teams in disguise, because only one character is really doing the damage. So in conclusion, hopefully you understand now that just by adding in a reaction with, you can say, different colored numbers doesn't make it better or worse by default. You have to look at the team synergy, execution, and overall performance as a whole. And we know this for a fact. If you look at the history of speedruns, it's generally a mix of reaction teams, mono teams, hyper carry teams with one character dealing damage. Don't be fooled into thinking just because you aren't playing reactions that reactions are the end all be all for team building. So back to this Klee team, that previous discussion was very relevant for her, since you can say this is the strongest, most simplest, and arguably easiest to play and most flexible Klee team. It's also generally her most popular team too. So clearly it's a team played due to the great synergy between all 4 characters, and together they just happen to not do reactions. This team is very flexible, feels smooth in both single target and AoE content, since all the buffs and debuffs in the team are pretty much constant and easy to reapply. You don't really lose much by making up your own rotation to suit a specific fight. So for example, you can easily delay Xiangling's burst and use it whenever you need it. You can use Kazuha's skill liberally for on-demand grouping. And you can even stay on Klee as long as you need if you need to juggle enemies and stop them from attacking you. So this flexibility takes the team to the next level, making it not just a good Klee team, but a great team overall. Its main weakness is quite clear if it's countered by a Pyro shield, and sometimes there will be abysses where this would be the case, which is annoying. But if there isn't such counters, usually this team is pretty fast and consistent in speedrunning at lower and mid-budget investment levels. Here's an example on how all the teammates synergize with each other. Pyro only teammates for Kazuha makes it easy for him to swap the correct element. And mono reaction teams mean all party members utilize his damage buff. These two together make it easy to maximize his utility without any difficult setups or annoyance. And then also his skill has suction for both Klee's mines and Goba. And you can even say that Klee's mines increase the power of Kazuha's skill, as together it feels like your Kazuha skill is doing more damage. Then for Klee, she maximizes all team buffs and debuffs. For example, Xiangling C1, C6, Bennett C6, and easy 100% VV and Kazuha buff uptime. All these buffs and debuffs amplify all her damage. Also, as we've covered, unlike a Vape or Melt reaction, all these buffs and debuffs amplify 100% of her damage. Also, Kazuha's stamina reduction talent, it improves Klee's consistency with dash cancelling, and it gives her charge attack more flexibility. You notice you get quite a bit more stamina to play around with. Klee also makes use of Xiangling C6, which, as I mentioned before, that constellation typically has low value because Xiangling can't really benefit from it, but Klee can. And also, whilst Klee doesn't have a nuke like Child might, her skill does have some front-loaded damage, especially when you use 2 in a row, and its energy generation allows flexible play to be adapted to as needed. For Xiangling, her C1 inflicts a small debuff and her C6 provides a small buff. These pretty much buff the entire team, aside from some of Kazuha's attacks. Pyro Nahida also follows the player model, so it works very effectively with both Kazuha and Klee's forms of crowd control. This team just has a lot of portability and movement, so you're not really stuck playing inside Bennett's burst, especially because Xiangling and Klee snapshot a lot of their damage. And lastly, having 2 Pyro teammates, it makes Xiangling a lot more friendly in terms of generating energy for her burst. For Bennett, there isn't really that much to talk about, but it's quite important that the entire team has abilities that can snapshot his buffs. And also this one is kind of niche, but because this team generates so much pyro energy particles, you can get away with building him for damage and not having energy issues with his burst. One significant strength with this team is its high floor on damage output. And what I mean by that is, essentially aside from Klee's normal and charge attacks, the entire team's output snapshots a ton of buffs, and these abilities do not require trigger activations like needing to constantly normal attack, like for example with Xingqiu or Yelan's burst. So Xiangling's Pyronado will spin regardless, Klee's burst will home and target enemies, and even Klee's leftover mines will be pulled to wherever the player positions Kazuha. This can make the team easier to pilot than other Klee teams and even some other Xiangling teams, as you can say there's less variance in total output from a skilled player versus one of less skill. So by the time you use Klee's skill and burst, most of the team's work is done. You can even sometimes see videos on YouTube or Bilibili of people AFKing. But of course, skill players can take it to the next level with effective positioning, animation cancelling, and charge attacking during Klee's damage window. And doing this will of course provide greater numbers, but overall it is quite noticeable how much guaranteed damage the team has. This also doesn't just apply to the team's damage, but also the team's energy. Even though Klee's charge attacks, her talent, it generates a good amount of tail end energy for the team. The rest of the team's skills, including Klee's own elemental skill, a lot of the team's skills are front loaded before you really start Klee's damage window. That might be hard to understand, but if you can imagine, if enemies are defeated earlier than expected, like for example halfway through your rotation, in a lot of teams, it's highly likely that you might be lacking energy for the next chamber. For example, this could be a situation in a lot of Raiden teams. But because this monopyro team front loads a lot of energy, for this team it's quite common to start the next Abyss chamber with your team's energy in quite healthy situations. And then you factor in the team's flexibility, like Klee being able to start the next chamber using her skill at the start. Even then, that can help patch up your team's energy situation before the Abyss fight really starts. I would say this makes the team incredibly fluid across an entire Abyss floor, and this is something people might not always factor in. Here's an example on how you can gear the team. This example has budget weapons, so obviously you can scale this up with whatever you have. Klee is really good at solving Xiangling's energy issues, so if you notice, this number here might be lower than you're used to in many other teams. But I always recommend testing these numbers for yourself to fine tune it yourself. After all, these are just ballpark figures I give for guidelines. And I even give two different numbers depending on how strong you are or how short the chamber is. This is because in shorter fights, Klee has 2 charges of her skill. So the stronger you are, the less likely you are to fight with only 1 charge at a time. As for Klee's weapons, the Width Sith is still her strongest weapon overall. But since she isn't doing reactions here, it can be kinda RNG. If you get the EM buff from its passive, your damage will be lower. So if that happens, you can either power through it or reset the chamber. Or if you don't want to bother with the RNG, you can just use something else like Lost Prayer. For Kazuha, all his popular weapons can work well in this team. Even Freedom Sworn can be a big damage buff here, especially because Xiangling and Klee snapshot his buffs. If you're using Favonius Sword or Sax Sword, then that can generate some extra energy for himself and the team. So you can easily just stack EM on your artifacts, but if using Freedom Sworn or Iron Sting, then you probably might want an energy recharge sands. However, this team does function pretty well even if you don't use his burst, so it's not a reaction team where his burst is mandatory for the team to function. So although energy recharge is very good for him, I wouldn't panic if you don't have enough. Lastly for Xiangling, in case it wasn't obvious, she doesn't need an EM weapon or EM stats in this team, so you can just worry about crit, ER and attack. The catch is really good in this team. There's also a lot of different rotations and setups you can do. It's good to adapt to the situation and do whichever you feel is best for each particular encounter. I'm just going to show a bunch of different examples here. If you don't have Kazuha, then Sucrose can substitute well in this team. She will be an overall downgrade since she has longer cooldowns on her grouping and suction, she has less buffs and she has less personal damage, but she still has a solid amount of utility that the team needs. Ideally, you have a C6. Her burst is really important to emulate Kazuha's role, and the team obviously doesn't care about her EM share, so you would want to stack a lot of ER on her. I would say 200 ER is the goal, and you can use one of these 3 weapons. Favonius Codex for team energy and easy bursts, Sack Frags for an extra skill which means more energy and more grouping, or the third option, if you really know what you're doing, you can use TTDS to either increase Klee or Xiangling's damage, although this will probably reduce her consistency in using her burst, but this might be worth it for you depending on the fight, it's up to you. Zhongli can also work. He can either replace Kazuha or Xiangling depending on who you prefer. I said it earlier in the guide, but he can be very helpful, for example in these difficult events, or even if you're finding an Abyss Chamber difficult, he can make it a lot more comfortable. Just building for a lot of HP, he can use Archaic Petra or he can use 4-piece Tenacity. Petra is better because it gives a huge damage buff, which is kind of similar to Kazuha's damage buff, but you will need to make sure you pick up the Pyro Shard on field with Zhongli. However, if you find that annoying, or even if you don't have this artifact set because it is more of a niche artifact set, you can use 4-piece Tenacity. The team-wide attack buff isn't as good as Petra's damage bonus, but it's still okay. I've just got a quick summary of pros and cons for monopyro teams. This team is very situational but can be very strong. It's basically mono pyro but with double Anemo, and this variation scales very well in AoE content with tons of enemies. You basically replace Xiangling with Venti, and Klee works well here because Xiangling has issues hitting enemies in Venti's burst, and you're able to just spam Klee's elemental skill into the vortexes. Also, some enemies are too heavy to be thrown into Venti's vortex naturally, which would disrupt your grouping. However, Klee's charge attacks with Juggling, it can fling these enemies into his vortex and basically force them into it. Here's some examples for how to gear this team. These are just basic weapons, so you can scale up with whatever you have, and as always, these energy recharge figures are just ballpark figures, especially because a team like this is very mobbing focused, so you get a lot of energy from defeating tons of enemies, so you may not need that much energy recharge at all. And I've also got some rotations you can try, but these are very flexible and very adaptable. With Burgeon teams, one of the main advantages to playing these teams is that you can play both Klee and Nahida together for cuteness. Burgeon teams have also been getting very popular recently. For example, if we look at some usage rates, Klee's usage is climbing, and a good portion of that is through playing all these Burgeon teams. One of the reasons why they are played is not necessarily because of damage, but because of puzzle solving and the elements involved, which are very good for shield breaking in these abyss floors. For example, this Hydro shield is weak to Dendro, these Cryo shields are weak to Pyro, and this final guy with a tough Pyro shield, so you want Hydro there. Also, throughout the past year of Sumeru, like almost every abyss has had blessing buffs that heavily incentivize playing a Dendro team. whether it buffs their reaction damage or just elemental mastery. Then there's a lot of favourable layouts and enemy makeups in these floors too. And that's not just limited to shield breaking, but also things like several waves of enemies, which makes it difficult to reapply debuffs like VV unless you switch back into your Anemo Teammate. Things like that can reduce DPS of many traditional teams, including Klee's Mono Pyro, and they can also put enemies spread out, which can interfere with your grouping. This particular thing is well countered by Nahida's elemental skill, which soul links enemies and makes them all take damage even if they're not close to each other. For Klee in particular, first of all, I do want to give a shout out to this channel because I noticed that they figured this out early as well, is that Klee is actually very strong with Burgeon. Number one, the blast radius on her pyro attacks are very effective at hitting Dendro cores to create the explosions. This also makes for easy gameplay because Klee can just spam normal attacks in these teams. You don't need to do any mad animation cancels or anything complicated at all. You can just spam normal attacks. On this point in comparison, we've actually noticed that a character like Yanfei, for some reason she actually has a lot more issues than Klee in terms of being able to hit these Dendro cores. Number two is that Klee, being a catalyst user, means she has on-demand access to pyro attacks. Specifically, unlike some other characters, she does not require her elemental burst to access pyro attacks, as well as the burst itself not really bringing in much in this role. You only really need to use the burst if you want extra shield breaking. Ultimately, this means that she can fully build for EM without having to worry about energy recharge or having to use less efficient weapons. If you combine these max EM builds with a weapon like Sacrificial Fragments, Klee can actually have some of the highest elemental mastery you can get for a Burgeon character, and this can lead to some of the highest Burgeon hits for a Pyro character. But remember, a lot of this EM stacking is very optional. You can just use a crit weapon like Lost Prayer or the Wood Sith, and you can also use a 4-piece Crimson Witch set, and you can build a crit EM hybrid sort of build. Her being an on-field Burgeon trigger, this also means she has the potential to benefit from various buffs that only apply to the on-field character. For example, a lot of people used to talk about Toma in Burgeon, but if you want to use Toma off-field, that means he can't take advantage of Nahida's burst, which buffs your EM a lot, and also something like Baizhu's burst, which buffs your on-field character's reaction damage a lot too. You can of course use Toma on-field, but then that would negate the benefit of him being able to play off-field, which means you can't use another character on-field instead. And speaking of Toma, he obviously would have to build for a lot of energy recharge, which means he doesn't get as much EM as Klee. Third point, I've already covered this in the weapon section, but Sacrificial Fragments is a very strong weapon and Klee has theoretically great synergy with it, especially in Burgeon teams because she can take advantage of its elemental mastery finally. Her synergy with Sacrificial Fragments is that Jumpy Dump T usually has a very long cooldown of 20 seconds, but Sacrificial Fragments resetting her skill allows you to use it more frequently, which means you get a lot more energy generation and you also get its off-field pyro application too. In comparison, other sacrificial weapons give energy recharge as its substat, whereas luckily Sacrificial Fragments gives elemental mastery. This one is also very relevant at the moment in the current Abyss, which is that Klee has the ability to adapt and elevate the amount of pyro application she needs. You can add in her elemental skill, charge attacks, or even her burst. Whilst this is less relevant for general Burgeon gameplay because you usually just spam normal attacks and elemental skills, this can significantly help when needing to shield break enemies, in particular like these Cryo Heralds in the current Abyss. In comparison, an alternative character like Toma may struggle because his burst has very low pyro application and it's not very good at applying pyro to enemies compared to how it's pretty good at blowing up Dendro cores. Burgeon teams, whilst it's hard to say they're meta because there's more Dendro characters, they definitely have got a lot better over time, mostly because originally there wasn't really any defensive Dendro teammates. And also there wasn't Nahida yet, who has very strong Dendro application. So with this Dendro application and with this defensive utility, it's a lot easier to play these other Pyro characters rather than needing to rely on Toma. And like I said, some of these other Pyro characters like Klee have advantages like very high EM and no burst reliance. Burgeon also required at least one Hydro and one Dendro teammate, which severely limited teammate options. Originally, Kogumi was one of the few viable options. She had very strong off-field healing with her skill, along with her taking the Hydro teammate slot. Although she still works okay, relying on her does present many functional issues. Firstly, the range of her skill can feel pretty restrictive, especially with the chaotic nature of Burgeon teams. You will notice it's very easy to be fighting enemies outside of the jellyfish's range, and then you lose your Hydro application, which is a disaster in these teams. In teams like Nilou teams, Kogumi can use sacrificial fragments to help with this, but you probably want Klee on your sacrificial fragments, which presents another issue. Secondly, just Kogumi overall, since she has just been used on field, the Hydro application of her skill, which isn't being supplemented with her Hydro basic attacks in her burst. It's very easy for enemies to just be burning and therefore crippling Dendro core production and therefore crippling Burgeon reactions themselves. I prefer other options instead. For example, Baizhu and Kirara, who came out recently, they feel much more synergistic in this role. Furthermore, if you use double Dendro, this activates Dendro Resonance, giving the team more EM for even more Burgeon damage. One of the main benefits to using these supports is that Xingqiu can function extremely well as an offensive Hydro support. His Hydro application is mobile, allowing for easy repositioning, and he has multiple sources of Hydro application, both his burst and the orbiting rain swords from his skill. Also, although his damage reduction, it doesn't actually reduce the Burgeon recoil damage, it still strengthens your teammates' shields and reduces the damage enemies will actually deal to you, which is very helpful. And also, I do like the fact that he's a 4-star character in this team. Alongside a defensive character like Kirara or Shinobu, having these 4-star options definitely helps a lot with the accessibility of Klee Burgeon teams. Nahida, I would say, is very critical to these teams, since her Dendro application is consistent enough to allow for some stability of Burgeon reactions, and if you just have to rely on a solo Dendro like Baizhu or Kirara, you'll notice that will very quickly lead to instability. So it's why, to be honest, I just say that Nahida is mandatory in these teams. As mentioned earlier, her Elemental Burst also provides significant Elemental Mastery to Klee. You can get up to 250 and it's very easy to get way over 1000 EM on your Klee. Also, as I mentioned earlier, you don't need to use Baizhu or Kirara or Shinobu. Zhongli also works in this slot. If you want to compare Baizhu and Kirara, they both work well, but both have slight differences. You could say Baizhu is more of a healer than a shielder, since his shielding is fairly weak. And his Elemental Burst has a long 14-second duration, which means he requires less swapping into. Whereas with Kirara, I would say her shielding is very strong, but you need to reapply her shield regularly and you need to use her Elemental Burst regularly too, since without her burst, she doesn't really contribute much off-field Dendro application without her C4. Whilst it's still pretty safe to rely on just Nahida's Dendro application, it's much more comfortable to have additional sources, so you want to use her burst quite a lot, and if you have a C4 then even better. Another obvious thing is Kirara obviously doesn't have healing, although I wouldn't say this is that much of an issue. As I've said multiple times now, you just have to keep swapping back into her just to make sure that your shield is up. And lastly, Baiju's A4 talent will buff Klee's Burgeon reaction damage, whereas Kirara does have a pretty good C6 which buffs the team's elemental damage. These are some example teams, and here's some example gearing. Again, especially these energy recharge figures are just ballpark guidelines, so I always recommend you testing out yourself and fine-tuning with your own account. Using Shinobu here is actually pretty popular. I actually kind of like it. She makes things very chaotic, which suits Klee, and I would almost say it's an evolution of the old Overload teams. You'll get Burgeons, Hyper Blooms, Overloads, and some Vaporize and Burning reactions. Playing Shinobu does have a few downsides though. One is that she is not a shielder, so you don't get that extra interrupt resist, which means you've just got Xingqiu's interruption resist. This can lead to scenes where you sometimes have Klee flying all over the place. Then there's also the fact that you have to balance Shinobu's healing with her reaction capabilities. Luckily, I've already farmed my Shinobu artifacts. You can see they are EM focused but have a lot of HP substats. This is also something built into her kit. You can see she converts EM into extra healing. Lastly, if you're lucky and you have Nilou's signature weapon, this can help both her HP and EM a lot. I've also put together an overall conclusion on Burgeon teams with pros and cons.
しょ。
So here's a team for support Klee. Although since this uses C2 Klee and you want a very strong Yelan, this does of course mean not everyone can play it. Yelan Vape is one of the most ridiculously strongest teams in the game. It pretty much always uses Yelan and Kazuha, and Klee is the strongest option for the Pyro teammate, although sometimes you can use Xiangling or Bennett. And then the final teammate, you usually have Nilou or Mona if you have them. So with Klee, this core takes advantage of stacking several multipliers to buff Yelan's output, but due to Yelan's HP scaling, she is a tricky character to maximize buffs on, so this team right here is a perfect example of Klee's use as a support. And another reason why Nilou is a perfect teammate in this team too is because she also has similar HP scaling that Yelan has. Here's some examples of some stacked multipliers, which is Kazuha's Ascension 4 talent damage buff. He also has Resistance Shred from his 4-piece VV. Klee applying the Pyro, which gives the Vaporize multiplier. She also has C2 for Defense Shred, and she has 4-piece Instructor for EM. These are just a few multipliers, but if you notice, they are all different multipliers to each other. There can also be some crossing here, like for example, if your Klee has Nahida's signature weapon, she can give extra EM. If Kazuha has C2, he can give extra EM. If you use Mona, she can give damage bonus. But in terms of the basic multipliers, I do find it quite interesting how there's all these different sources of multipliers. In terms of Yelan's build, as I said, not everyone can be able to use a team like this. A lot of the time, a starting point is her Constellation 1 and her signature weapon, Aqua Simulacra. This gives her multiple skill uses and it gives her sufficient output to be able to utilize that as a main DPS. So you do want quite an invested Yelan if you are going to play a vape team like this. Obviously it gets even more crazy if she's at C6 and you have some of the other dolphin things. And then you can use Nilou as well, who basically benefits from all the same things that Yelan already benefited from. And she gives Hydro Resonance, and she can also wield the key for even more elemental mastery buffs. I covered Klee's weapons in the weapons section, but she can use either Sacrificial Fragments, Favonius Codex, or Nahida's signature weapon. All of these will give extra utility for Klee. Sacrificial Fragments gives extra skill uses, Favonius Codex gives extra team energy, and obviously Nahida's weapon gives extra EM. As with all Pyro characters, you can use Klee on field in vaporized teams. I covered this in my previous video, but there are a lot of gameplay comparisons done by Discord players, and these teams can be close in damage to Kazuha Monopyro teams versus bosses or single target. Although I wouldn't say it clears faster than Monopyro, and it definitely won't in AoE. Most importantly, it doesn't play to Klee's strengths, and it doesn't matter how much Hydro application you have. I can give a TLDR. Just because Klee has a lot of Pyro application doesn't mean she doesn't have ICD issues. She has standard ICD on most of her attacks, meaning even if you have insane Hydro application, like for example having Yelan and Xingqiu, you're still probably only vaping a percentage of Klee's attacks. And then you combine the fact that her damage distribution is very evenly spread between her talents. This means you're only really buffing a percentage of her damage too, and whatever you're not vaping is mostly going unbuffed or having very minimal buffs. That's one of the reasons why teammates like Kazuha or Xiangling have great synergy with Klee. Their debuffs and buffs increase the damage for all of Klee's attacks. So her ICD and damage distribution is irrelevant, and especially buffing her Jumpy Dumpty elemental skill is something that enables front-loaded damage and flexible gameplay. Just relying on the charge attacks will make it difficult to have those very front-loaded strong damage windows, especially with bosses who have those transitional phases like PMA. That's not to say that on-field vaporized teams are weak teams. As I said, you're still probably clearing Abyss Chambers pretty fast as long as you've got a well-invested account, but Even then, that could be inconsistent due to losing Anemo grouping if you're playing double Hydro. And not just Anemo grouping, but potentially AoE consolidation and Klee's mind damage. Actually, I would say you can also just replace Yelan with someone like Sucrose or Kazuha and be okay. Their grouping and extra damage buffs can help Klee quite a bit. Here's some gear examples for double Hydro. Ideally, you want one of your Hydros on an energy generating weapon like a Favonius weapon or sacrificial weapon, and the other Hydro on a more offensive weapon. I imagine for most people that would mean Yelan on a Favonius bow since it's free, and Xingqiu on whatever 5-star sword you might have. Or you can do the opposite and you might give Yelan a buffing weapon like Elegy for the End, meaning you want your Xingqiu instead on something like Favonius sword. For reverse melt teams, you would add Rosaria instead of Xiangling for reverse melt damage. I would say you really want Rosaria C2 here for the burst duration increase. These reverse melt teams can be good teams, however, honestly they're pretty outdated. Mostly because setting up the team buffs and debuffs for Rosaria require precise swirls with Kazuha. It's just a lot more annoying and essentially only realistic in AoE fights. I will show a setup for a single target fight, however, you will see it's just very tedious. Also, as Rosaria's burst is just stuck into one place, you can call it circle impact, compared to Xiangling's burst, which you can move around with. Here's how you would set up the team in a single target fight. And here's how you can set up the team in an AoE fight. You can see this is a lot more straightforward, and if the enemies don't move about much, then it can be pretty good. Here's some gear examples for Rosaria's build. She does want to be dealing a lot of damage, but you will need to be building quite a bit of ER. I recommend aiming for 160%. Also, a C4 can help with this. She can also run Lava Walker in this team and something like Deathmatch or Dragon's Bane, whichever weapon you have. Also, I'm not sure if I would recommend ESF here because her skill will be reverse melting in this team for good damage. As for the rest of the team, since you're losing Xiangling's Pyro energy, compared to Mono Pyro, you would have to go slightly up on the team's energy requirements, maybe going up to 120% on Klee. Overload teams are actually pretty fun, although I would say they're similar to reverse melt in terms of them being kind of outdated now. Still, the overload utility is useful since you're basically combining Klee's charge attacks with overload, which makes a lot of juggling and a lot of stagger potential, and this can make clearing content easier due to enemies barely being able to attack. Just make sure you're staying close to them with Klee so they're not flying too much away. The obvious issue with this particular team is that you're lacking Anemo grouping, although you could replace Beidou with Kazuha here. And you could also get similar reaction chaos by using the Shinobu Burgeon team. And those teams also benefit from better shield breaking variety. And they also have Nahida's Soul Link, which helps with the issue of not having Anemo grouping. And as well as Dendro teams in general benefit from all the Abyss blessings that benefit Dendro teams. Similar thing with the idea of overvape teams causing both overload and vaporized reactions. Whilst there isn't currently a standout team, who knows, these compositions might get even better adding Dendro reactions into the mix. There's a lot to look forward to. That was a clip from my video last year and I ended up being right. The Burgeon teams with Shinobu are kind of an evolution of these overvape teams and the chaos is pretty fun. So thanks for watching. If you did watch the entire video, then I hope you found it helpful and thank you. If you're a new Klee main, then hopefully you found some of this educational or helpful. or if you're an old Klee main, maybe you learned some things you might not have learned before. Especially if you're a new Klee main, as I said in the beginning of the video, I highly do recommend you joining a Klee community like the Klee Discord. I have the link in the video description. It's very hard to get good quality Klee info outside of her dedicated communities, and I wouldn't want you to miss out. Lastly, if you're new to my channel, I have done lots of Klee videos in the past, including speedruns and more niche guides. So if you're interested in those, you can just check through my channel. Thanks for watching.